When the summer of 1914 began, the leaders of Europe stepped into the greatest disaster of the modern age with confidence that now seems ridiculous. They believed the coming conflict would be quick, clean, and controlled. Every major nation predicted a fast victory. Ordinary people expected celebrations by Christmas. Newspapers printed maps showing the enemy crushed in a few weeks. Generals used old theories and old playbooks without questioning how the world had changed. They were blind to the danger sitting right in front of them. The war they expected was a romantic version of battle, filled with cavalry charges and swift maneuvers. The war they got was the exact opposite. It became a slow-moving, grinding machine that crushed millions of men, destroyed empires, and reshaped the world. That gap between expectation and reality stands as the central mistake that made the First World War possible. To understand how such a large failure could happen, imagine a room filled with the top military minds of Europe in 1914. These men were trained in a world shaped by the 1800s. They believed discipline, morale, and the will to attack were the keys to success. They assumed that if they pushed hard enough, charged fast enough, and kept pressure on the enemy, victory would follow. They ignored or minimized every technological change that had completely reshaped warfare. Rapid-fire artillery, smokeless powder, bolt-action rifles, machine guns, and barbed wire had all transformed the battlefield into a death trap. Yet these leaders acted as if they were still fighting Napoleon. Think of a general looking at his maps and seeing a massive arrow drawn across enemy territory. That arrow represented his plan: move fast, push through, force the enemy to collapse. He believed the soldiers would march across open ground without being torn apart by machine gun nests. He believed cavalry could still break lines as they once had. He believed artillery could soften up defenses enough for infantry to move in clean formations. This blind trust in old tactics made sense to him because he had grown up in a time when these ideas worked. What he could not grasp was that firepower had outrun human movement. A machine gun could fire hundreds of rounds in the time it took a man to run a few paces. A well-set-up artillery battery could fire shells faster than older armies could load a single shot. Defensive weapons had advanced far beyond offensive tactics. Yet the leaders still ordered frontal assaults, as if none of that mattered. Now, picture the soldiers who marched into this nightmare. Young men from farms, cities, factories, and schools walked into battle believing similar ideas. They trusted their governments, they trusted their generals, they trusted the promise that they would be home by Christmas. Many had never seen a machine gun, let alone faced one firing at full speed. Many had never seen the power of modern artillery. They stepped into the open thinking courage alone would protect them. The shock of reality came fast. Once they reached the front, they realized the enemy was not a distant figure across a field. The enemy was a line of weapons waiting silently, ready to fire thousands of rounds that no human could outrun. One example helps make this clear. Imagine a group of infantrymen marching toward a small ridge. Their officers tell them the enemy is weak and that a strong push will break through. They move forward in tight formation because that is how they were trained. As they reach halfway across the field, a single machine gun opens fire. The bullets tear through the line in seconds. The men do not even see the enemy. They only hear the sound and watch their friends fall. They try to run for cover, but there is none. The plan collapses instantly because the assumption behind it was wrong. That scene repeated thousands of times across Europe. The leaders had planned for a quick advance. Instead, they created a massive slaughter. The reason this mistake turned into a global catastrophe lies in the scale of the war. Every major power in Europe joined in. It was not one army making a poor decision. It was every major army making the same poor decision at the same time. When they all charged forward expecting movement, they all collided with modern firepower and stopped cold. Since none of them had a plan for what came next, they dug in. That produced the trench lines that soon stretched from the coast of Belgium to the border of Switzerland. The long stalemate began not because anyone wanted it, but because no one had prepared for anything else. They had expected speed. They got paralysis. Once the front froze, the generals tried again and again to break the deadlock. They ordered more assaults. They believed more force would solve the problem. They believed the enemy must be close to breaking. What they did not understand was that the defensive advantage was too strong. A machine gun crew sheltered behind earthworks could kill hundreds of attackers before they reached striking distance. Artillery shells could land miles away with accuracy. Barbed wire could stop entire units in place, trapping them in front of guns waiting for them. The battlefield became a world where courage did not matter if technology was not on your side. Yet attack after attack went forward because leaders refused to accept that the world had changed. To see how deeply this mistake ran, imagine a general reading a report from the front. The report says that thousands of soldiers fell in a single morning. It says the enemy lines remain unbroken. It says the defenders suffered almost no losses. Instead of stopping the attack, the general orders another one. He tells himself the troops will push harder. He tells himself the artillery will do better next time. He tells himself the enemy cannot keep holding. But the same thing happens again. Soldiers fall, and the lines stay the same. This pattern continued not for days or weeks, but for years. The belief that the war would be short died slowly, not instantly. Even after the first battles collapsed into trench warfare, many leaders insisted that victory was close. They told the public the enemy was weak. They told the soldiers their sacrifice would not be wasted. They told themselves that one big offensive would finish the war. But the war did not end. It expanded. It drew in more countries, more fronts, more resources, and more people. The longer it dragged on, the more it became clear that the early confidence had been a fantasy. The tragedy here is not just that leaders were wrong, it is that their mistake cost millions of lives. The men who marched in expecting a short war never imagined they would spend years in trenches filled with mud, rats, and danger. They never imagined they would face poison gas, heavy shells, and endless gunfire. They never imagined their world would disappear in a storm of metal. They trusted the people in charge, and those people failed to understand the world they lived in. That failure is why the war is called a seminal catastrophe. It shaped everything that came after. It destroyed empires. It wrecked economies. It spread grief across every nation involved. It left deep wounds in Europe that never healed. It set the stage for even greater disasters in the future. All of this happened because the leaders believed the war would be short, simple, and controlled. They believed old tactics would still work. They believed technology could be ignored. They believed morale would overcome machines. They were wrong at every level. As you hear this story and picture leaders marching into a nightmare while insisting it would be over by Christmas, remember that history is filled with moments where confidence hides ignorance. The First World War stands as the clearest case of this. If you want more strange, unbelievable, or outright foolish moments from the past, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we dig into the decisions that shaped the world in ways nobody expected. The next layer of disaster came from something most people in 1914 never saw and would not have understood even if they had. The governments of Europe were not only trapped by pride or old ideas, they were trapped by their own planning. Every major power had created huge, detailed, and rigid mobilization schedules. These schedules told them exactly how to move millions of soldiers, thousands of trains, mountains of supplies, and entire national economies within a matter of days. These plans looked orderly on paper. They looked like the product of logic and discipline. But in reality, they acted like a machine that, once started, could not be stopped. That machine is what historians call the tyranny of the mobilization clock. To understand this problem, imagine a massive railroad network stretching across a continent. Every train has a number. Every stop has a time. Every route is planned down to the minute. Soldiers are told which car to board and what equipment they must carry. Supplies are loaded according to priority. Artillery pieces are moved in a precise order. Horses, ammunition, rations, spare parts, uniforms, and medical supplies are arranged so that they reach the front exactly when needed. All of this has to happen at the same time. If one train is late, the next train is blocked. If one supply unit is delayed, another unit does not receive food. If one army corps is out of position, the rest of the plan falls apart. This is how European military planning looked before the First World War. Every power believed war would be won or lost in the first weeks. They believed the side that mobilized faster would have the upper hand. They believed hesitation would be fatal. This belief pushed them to design plans that were exact and unforgiving. The best example is the German Schlieffen Plan. It was a huge, complex operation that required the rapid movement of millions of soldiers through Belgium and Luxembourg, sweeping around the French defenses in a wide wheel. It could not be slowed. It could not be paused. It could not be adjusted once in motion. If Germany mobilized, the plan had to be carried through. The trains had to run. The troops had to cross borders. The war had to begin whether politicians were ready or not. Picture a general standing over a large map. He has spent his entire career designing a plan built on speed. He knows that to defeat France, he must strike fast before Russian troops gather in the east. He believes any delay will doom Germany to fighting two fronts at once. He is terrified of losing those first days. So when tension rises in Europe, he tells his government that the army must mobilize right now. He is not thinking about diplomacy. He is not thinking about negotiation. He is thinking about trains, timetables, and the belief that the first hours of war decide everything. Now imagine the political leader in the same room. He sees diplomats trying to calm the crisis. He sees allies sending messages. He sees a chance, however small, to avoid war. But he also hears his generals saying that delay is impossible. If he hesitates, he risks national defeat. If he refuses mobilization, he risks looking weak. If he tries to slow the process, the entire military structure will collapse. He has no flexibility. The machine is too big, too complex, and too fragile. So even if he wants more time, even if he still hopes for peace, he feels forced to push the mobilization button. Once he pushes it, the decision is locked. This is exactly what happened across Europe in 1914. Austria-Hungary mobilized partly because its generals believed they had to move fast to punish Serbia. Russia mobilized because its generals believed delay would leave them open to a German attack. Germany mobilized because its generals insisted that the Schlieffen Plan only worked if they began at once. France mobilized because Germany mobilized. Each country claimed it was acting defensively. Each country was actually acting because they feared losing time. The mobilization clock became a trap that pulled them all forward. To make this clear, think of a line of dominoes arranged on a table. Each domino represents a national mobilization order. Once the first domino tips, the next one must fall. No one can pull one piece out without collapsing the chain. In 1914, Austria-Hungary leaned on Serbia. Russia leaned back. Germany leaned into Russia. France leaned into Germany. The lines were rigid. The pressure built until the first push came. After that, nothing could stop the rest from falling. Another example shows just how inflexible the plans were. When Russia ordered partial mobilization, which was meant as a limited response, the Russian generals objected. They claimed partial mobilization was impossible because the system was designed for full mobilization only. They said the railroads would be confused, troops would be misdirected, and units would not reach the right fronts. In their view, the only safe choice was to mobilize the entire army. That move was seen by Germany as a direct threat, because German planners believed Russian mobilization must be met with German mobilization. Once Germany mobilized, the French plans triggered automatically. Belgium was invaded because the German plan required that route. Britain joined because the invasion of Belgium violated a treaty. A crisis between two countries became a world war because the mobilization plans did not allow any other path. Picture ordinary citizens hearing the news, one day the streets are calm. The next, posters appear telling men to report for duty. Trains fill with soldiers. Horses are marched through towns. Families gather at stations to say goodbye. They do not understand that their leaders are not making free decisions. They are following plans made years earlier, plans that they now cannot change. These plans move faster than diplomacy. They move faster than peace talks. They move faster than reason. Once the trains start rolling, war becomes unavoidable. The most frightening part of this story is how simple a pause could have been. If any of the major powers had found a way to delay mobilization by even a few days, the crisis might have faded. Diplomats were sending messages trying to slow things down. Some leaders wanted more time, but their militaries told them delay was impossible. The machines they had built were too large. The timetables were too tight. The pressure was too strong. So even leaders who doubted the wisdom of war felt they had no choice but to follow the schedule. Imagine trying to stop a huge factory machine after someone hits the start button. The gears grind, the belts pull, the blades spin. You want to stop it, but the machine is too heavy, too loud, and too dangerous. You cannot reach the switch in time. That is what mobilization looked like in 1914. It was a machine that took over the governments running it. This is one reason the First World War spiraled out of control so quickly. The leaders did not wake up on a summer morning planning global war. They woke up facing a crisis they might have managed if they had more time. But the mobilization clock controlled that time. The Schlieffen Plan controlled Germany. The Russian timetable controlled Russia. The French timetable controlled France. These countries marched toward war not because they wanted a world conflict, but because their own systems gave them no flexibility. Once mobilization began, everything that followed felt inevitable. The armies moved, the borders were crossed, the war spread, and the world changed. This is the tragedy of the mobilization clock. It turned careful planning into a trap and transformed a regional crisis into a global catastrophe. The birth of mechanized slaughter during the First World War changed the way humans understood war itself. Before 1914, many nations still believed in the idea of the heroic charge. They pictured brave infantry advancing in neat lines. They imagined cavalry sweeping across open fields with sabers raised. They believed that courage and discipline could break any defense. When war began, generals carried these old ideas with them. They believed the war would be short. They believed morale could overpower firepower. They believed their men could push through enemy lines with enough spirit. They were wrong in every way. The trenches on the Western Front were not planned as permanent homes. At first, soldiers dug simple pits to avoid rifle fire. Then those pits grew deeper. They added duckboards, parapets, sandbags, and firing steps. They carved out dugouts for shelter. Rain filled the trenches with mud. Bodies sank into the ground. Rats crawled across sleeping soldiers. The smell of rot and wet earth never left. These trenches stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. They became the front line of a new kind of war, one ruled by machines rather than people. Machine guns shaped the battlefield more than any other weapon. A single machine gun team could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Soldiers said the guns mowed down attackers like grass. When an infantry unit climbed out of its trench and tried to cross no man's land, the machine gun crews waited. As soon as helmets rose above the parapet, the guns opened up, lines of men fell before they took 10 steps. Generals kept ordering assaults because they did not understand how powerful these guns had become. They believed enough soldiers could overwhelm the guns by sheer numbers. They sent wave after wave into the open. The guns never stopped. Artillery fire created another layer of destruction. Shells exploded day and night. At times, the sky turned black with smoke. The ground shook like an earthquake. Shrapnel tore through flesh and bone. High explosive shells buried men alive. Others lost their hearing or wandered in shock. Artillery caused most of the casualties in the war. Entire towns disappeared under shell fire. Forests became fields of splintered stumps. When soldiers marched toward the front, they could hear the guns miles away. The constant thunder became the soundtrack of their world. Generals still ordered frontal assaults. They believed that after enough artillery fire, the enemy trenches would collapse. They believed their men could walk forward and take the position. But artillery rarely destroyed the deep dugouts. When the shelling stopped, machine gun crews climbed out, set up their weapons, and waited for the attack. Soldiers were told to leave the trench, form a line, and march through mud that pulled at their boots. They carried rifles, packs, and bayonets. Many never made it halfway. A young soldier might wait for hours before the assault began. He would sit in the trench, gripping his rifle. Mud covered his uniform. He heard the whine of shells overhead. He smelled cordite, sweat, and decay. When the officer blew the whistle, he climbed the ladder. As soon as he exposed his head, he heard the enemy guns. Bullets snapped past him. He stepped onto the open ground, unsure if he would survive more than a few seconds. Men around him fell face first in the mud. Others tried to crawl, but were hit before they gained any distance. By the time the survivors reached halfway, they were too few to threaten the enemy line. Sometimes attackers reached the enemy trench. They fought with grenades, bayonets, and rifles. They found themselves fighting in narrow, twisted passages. The mud made movement slow. The smell of smoke and blood filled the air. Even if they captured the first trench, they often faced a second. By the time reinforcements arrived, the enemy had launched a counterattack. The attackers had no choice but to retreat or die. When they returned to their own trench, they discovered the price. Hundreds or thousands of men were gone. They had gained only a few hundred yards, or nothing at all. Cavalry units suffered the hardest blow to old military traditions. Horses had dominated battlefields for centuries. Armies believed mounted troops could break enemy lines with speed and shock. But machine guns turned cavalry charges into massacres. Horses could not outrun bullets. Riders fell before they came close. Some generals still tried to use cavalry early in the war. The results were predictable. After a few attempts, the cavalry units either dismounted or took on support roles. The age of the horse on the battlefield ended in the mud of the trenches. New weapons made the battlefield even more lethal. Poison gas drifted across no man's land. It burned eyes, lungs, and skin. Men choked as their throats closed. Gas masks became standard equipment, but they did not always work. Tanks appeared later in the war. They were slow and unreliable, but they crushed barbed wire and crossed trenches. Even so, early tanks often broke down or got stuck. Soldiers saw them as strange metal beasts that groaned across the field. Planes also entered the war. At first, they scouted enemy positions. Later, they dropped bombs and fought each other in the sky. The battlefield became a place where old and new weapons clashed side by side. One of the clearest examples of mechanized slaughter was the Battle of the Somme. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties. Many soldiers died before they fired a shot. Commanders believed their artillery had destroyed the German defenses. When the troops advanced, they found the wire still intact and the machine guns untouched. The Germans watched the British walk toward them in long lines. They fired until their barrels glowed. The battlefield became a graveyard before noon. Another example was Verdun. The French fought to hold every inch of ground. The Germans wanted to bleed the French army dry. The two sides pounded each other with artillery for months. Villages vanished, hills flattened. Soldiers fought in underground tunnels and crater fields. The mud swallowed bodies. The few who survived carried the trauma for life. Verdun became a symbol of the grinding mechanical nature of the war. Imagine a soldier at night, crouching in a trench. Rain falls. He wipes mud from his eyes. He hears the metal rattle of a machine gun being loaded across the field. He knows tomorrow may bring another assault. He knows he might climb the ladder and never come back. He thinks about home. He thinks about the men beside him. He wonders why his life depends on a few inches of ground that no one would care about if not for the war. He waits, knowing the machines never sleep. The birth of mechanized slaughter erased the line between soldier and target. The machines did not care about courage. They did not care about tradition. They did not care about the ideals generals followed into battle. They only cared about physics. If a man walked into the open, the machine gun cut him down. If a shell landed near him, it tore him apart. The war forced the world to confront a new truth. Human bodies could not stand against industrial weapons. This part of the script shows how the First World War became the first true industrial war, where factories produced death on an assembly line and entire nations fed their young men into machines that did not stop. The First World War did more than destroy armies. It destroyed the world that existed before it. When the war began in 1914, Europe was still ruled by old empires that traced their power back centuries. The Romanovs in Russia, the Habsburgs in Austria-Hungary, the Hohenzollerns in Germany, the Ottomans in the Middle East. These states believed they would last forever. They had royal families, long histories, military traditions, and large populations. But the war did not care about tradition. It cared only about numbers, industry, and the ability to survive pressure. As the war dragged on, these empires cracked. When they finally collapsed, the world discovered what happens when the centers of power disappear all at once. A global vacuum formed, new ideologies emerged, new nations rose, and for the first time, the United States stepped onto the world stage as a dominant force. To understand how these collapses happened, imagine a massive structure made of old wood. From far away, it looks strong. Up close, you see rot, strain, and old supports, ready to snap. The war was the final weight that broke the structure. Each empire entered the conflict, expecting victory in months. None expected a war that lasted years. None expected the cost. The war killed millions. It demanded resources the empires could not produce. It pushed their societies past the breaking point. In Russia, the Romanov family faced pressure from every side. The Russian army suffered heavy losses early in the war. Soldiers often lacked rifles and basic supplies. Many peasants joined the army out of duty, but they returned home in coffins. Food shortages hit major cities. Long lines formed outside bakeries. People grew angry. They blamed the Tsar for everything. The royal family grew isolated from their own nation. Rumors spread about corruption and incompetence. When the army began to collapse, the government collapsed with it. The Tsar abdicated. The Russian Empire disappeared within months. In the chaos that followed, revolutionaries seized control. Communism rose not because people wanted a new ideology, but because they were desperate for something that could replace a shattered system. The power vacuum in Russia became so deep that it swallowed everything around it and created a new kind of state with a new kind of purpose. Austria-Hungary collapsed under its own weight. It was a patchwork empire with dozens of ethnic groups held together by old agreements and a royal family that had ruled for centuries. Before the war, many groups already wanted independence. The war turned these desires into full demands. As casualties rose, loyalty faded. Food shortages hit the cities. Factories struggled to keep up with war production. The empire's armies lost ground on every front. When soldiers returned home, they found their regions talking about independence, not unity. When the war ended, Austria-Hungary split apart almost overnight. New nations formed in the space where one empire had stood. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, Yugoslavia, and others stepped into the map. This was not a slow political process. It was a rapid collapse, a landslide triggered by exhaustion and defeat. The Habsburg dynasty had ruled for hundreds of years. It ended in a few months. Germany faced a different kind of collapse. The German army fought fiercely until the end. Its lines held for most of the war, but the blockade starved the German population. Bread rationing became harsh. Families struggled to find fuel for winter. Factories ran out of materials. Soldiers at the front sensed that their sacrifices meant nothing if their families suffered at home. By 1918, morale collapsed. The government realized it could not continue. The Kaiser fled the country. The German Empire dissolved. A republic replaced it, but the transition was messy and violent. Armed groups fought in the streets. Different factions tried to claim control. Germany had lost the war, but the deeper loss was the fall of the old order. The Hohenzollerns were gone, and nothing stable took their place for years. The vacuum they left behind allowed extremist movements to rise later because people wanted something strong enough to fill the void. The Ottoman Empire also reached its breaking point. Before the war, it already struggled with internal rebellion and economic weakness. The war opened every wound at once. Fighting stretched the empire's resources thin. The army could not hold its territory. Arab regions revolted. The population faced starvation and disease. When the armistice was signed, the empire could not function as a state. European powers carved it apart. The old Ottoman system disappeared. In its place came new borders, new nations, and a new struggle for identity in the Middle East. Turkey emerged under new leadership, but the empire that had ruled for centuries was gone forever. For empires vanished within a short span of time. This level of collapse had not happened in modern history. The world had always had major powers. When one declined, another usually rose slowly. But the First World War crushed 4 at once. Entire regions lost their anchors. Imagine a map filled with empty spaces where old states used to stand. Those empty spaces became opportunities and dangers at the same time. Many groups seized the chance to declare independence. Others fell into civil war. Some looked for new ideas that could rebuild their societies. Communism filled one of those openings. Nationalism filled others. The collapse did not bring peace. It brought uncertainty. In this void, the United States gained influence. Before the war, America stayed away from European conflicts. It traded with Europe but avoided alliances. When the United States entered the war in 1917, it brought fresh troops, money, and industrial output. Its presence turned the tide. After the war, European states were weak. Their economies were broken. Their populations were tired and traumatized. The United States, meanwhile, stood unharmed. Its factories grew stronger during the war. Its financial power increased. Nations borrowed money from American banks. The US dollar became more important. Even though America tried to pull back into isolation, the world no longer worked without it. The war had opened a path for the United States to become a global power, even if it did not want the role yet. The vacuum also shaped new political movements. Communism rose in Russia because the old system collapsed completely. People were angry, hungry, and desperate. They wanted a government that promised order and equality. Whether the ideology achieved those things is another debate, but the reason it rose is simple. The war destroyed the state that held everything together. When that state fell, communism stepped in. The ripple effect spread across the world. Workers' movements grew in Europe. Rulers feared revolution. The map was not just changing on paper, it was changing in the minds of people who saw that their old rulers were not invincible. Imagine being a civilian at the time. You wake up to find your emperor has abdicated. Your currency loses value. Your army retreats. Your neighbors talk about independence or revolution. Statues of old rulers come down. New flags appear. You do not know what your country is anymore. This confusion was common across Europe and the Middle East. People lived through the end of worlds they had known all their lives. That level of instability created a generation ready to accept bold, risky ideas. Some of those ideas shaped the next century. When four major empires collapsed at the same time, the world faced a new kind of instability. Borders shifted, ideologies clashed. Nations tried to fill the void. Some succeeded, some failed. Some fell into even deeper chaos. The global power vacuum created by the First World War did not just change governments. It reshaped the entire structure of the modern world. The Treaty of Versailles was supposed to close the darkest chapter in modern history, but instead it planted the seeds for an even worse one. The leaders who gathered in Paris in 1919 believed they were writing the terms that would keep Europe safe for generations. They believed they were shaping a stable future. They believed they were punishing the guilty and rebuilding the broken. Instead, they created a document that guaranteed resentment, chaos, and revenge. To understand how the treaty set the stage for the next war, you need to see it the way ordinary. Germans saw it the way angry French leaders pushed it, and the way the rest of the world failed to question it. The treaty did not just end a war. It created a political climate so unstable that another one became unavoidable. The first and most damaging part of the treaty was the war guilt clause. This clause forced Germany to take complete responsibility for the entire war. The wording was absolute. Germany alone was blamed. For Germans, this clause felt like a lie written into international law. They believed that every major power had a hand in the start of the war. They saw alliances, mobilization plans, imperial competition, and the assassination in Sarajevo as the real causes. But the treaty required Germany to accept full guilt. That guilt turned into fuel for national anger. It struck at the identity of a people who already felt defeated and humiliated. Imagine being an ordinary German citizen in 1919. You've lost family members, you've survived years of hunger caused by the blockade. Your empire has collapsed. You are adjusting to a new and unstable republic. Then you read a treaty that says you and your country are responsible for everything. That kind of shock does not fade, it grows. The guilt clause mattered because it justified the second major part of the treaty, reparations. The Allied powers demanded massive financial payments from Germany. The bill was so large that many economists at the time said it could never realistically be paid. The reparations were designed to weaken Germany permanently, especially to satisfy France, which still carried scars from German invasions in 1870 and 1914. French leaders believed that Germany needed to be punished so heavily that it would never threaten France again. British leaders supported the idea, although they were more concerned with protecting their empire and paying their own debts. The result was a figure so high that it crushed Germany's economy. The new Weimar government faced inflation, debt, and shortages. To pay the reparations, the government printed more money. The value of the German mark collapsed. In 1923, hyperinflation reached absurd levels. People carried stacks of banknotes in wheelbarrows. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day because prices rose between morning and afternoon. Savings vanished. Families lost everything. Children used worthless banknotes as toys. This economic nightmare created deep bitterness. It also created a perfect environment for radical movements to grow. When people lose their savings, they stop trusting their government. When they lose their jobs, they stop trusting the system. When they lose hope, they look for someone to blame and someone else to follow. This is exactly what happened in Germany. Many Germans said the treaty was not a peace settlement, but a punishment disguised as law. They called it a diktat, meaning a dictated peace with no negotiation. They believed their country had been stabbed while already on the ground. The treaty demanded territory, colonies, and even access to raw materials. Germany lost land in the east and west. It lost its overseas empire. It lost control of the Rhineland. Its army was reduced to 100,000 men. It had no tanks, no aircraft, and no submarines. For a nation that had once prided itself on its military strength, this reduction felt like the removal of its identity. You cannot expect a nation that sees itself as strong to accept a document that makes it weak. The tension between national pride and enforced humiliation grew deeper each year. The treaty also created political instability beyond Germany. The collapse of the old empires left Europe full of fragile new states. These states needed support and cooperation to survive, but the treaty did not create structures strong enough to help them. Instead, it created a League of Nations with no real power. The United States refused to join it. Without American support, the League became symbolic rather than functional. It had no army, it had no enforcement. It could condemn aggression, but it could not stop it. This failure meant that when Germany, Italy, or Japan tested the limits of peace in the 1930s, the League could only watch. The treaty also created resentment outside Europe. Many people in colonial regions fought in the war, expecting freedom. Instead, the treaty divided former Ottoman lands and German colonies among the victors. This created frustration across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Nationalist movements grew. Anger spread. The global order became unstable. The treaty spoke of peace, but it acted like a reward system for the victors. It ignored millions of people who wanted independence. This oversight later fueled conflicts and revolutions. Inside Germany, the treaty turned political arguments into political battles. Different groups blamed each other for signing it. Leaders of the Weimar Republic said they had no choice. The Allied blockade continued until Germany signed the population needed food. The army was exhausted. They believed signing the treaty was the only way to avoid complete collapse. But political opponents called them traitors. The myth of the stab in the back spread claimed that the German army had not been defeated in the field, but had been betrayed by politicians and civilians at home. This myth was false, but it was powerful. It gave angry people a story to follow. It gave extremists a weapon. When the time came, they used it to gain influence. The treaty also punished Germany in ways that made cooperation impossible. If you want a defeated nation to become peaceful, you must give it a chance to recover. Instead, the treaty pushed Germany into a corner. Even moderate Germans believed they were living under unfair conditions. They believed the treaty was designed to destroy them, not to rebuild Europe. When a nation feels trapped, it becomes unpredictable. When it becomes unpredictable, it becomes dangerous. One of the clearest examples of the treaty's failure was the occupation of the Ruhr in 1923. France and Belgium sent troops into Germany's industrial heartland because Germany fell behind on payments. German workers went on strike. The government printed more money to support them. Hyperinflation spiraled. This crisis showed how the treaty's demands created disaster instead of stability. It also showed how easily external pressure could break an already weak state. Years later, when extremist groups promised to tear up the treaty and restore national pride, many Germans listened. They did not listen because they were naturally aggressive. They listened because their lives had been shaped by humiliation, poverty, and hopelessness. The treaty had created a generation that grew up angry and afraid. That generation became the audience for dangerous ideas. Once those ideas took hold, reversing them became impossible. The Treaty of Versailles was not only a failed peace, it was the foundation for the next global disaster. It created economic instability, political division, and national humiliation. It punished Germany without rebuilding it. It blamed one nation for a war caused by many. It replaced empires with weak states. It built an international system that could not enforce peace. The document was long, detailed, and confident, but in the end, it did not stop another war. It made one more likely. If you want more deep dives into the strange, tragic, and unbelievable corners of history, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian.